In the preceding segment, we examined the IPCC's case against CO2 at length and in their own words. We even showed you their very professional promotional video. We did so not only to be fair to the prosecution, but also to allow you to experience the full emotional impact and force of their arguments. We have to admit, they've made an impressive case. But now, hear our side of it. We will begin recognizing that the prosecution's case largely rests on an argument from authority. To be sure, the premier scientific authority on climate change is the IPCC, and we will address its credibility shortly. However, they also have appealed to the authority of all scientists and have alleged that there is an overwhelming consensus among them which puts the whole issue beyond debate. President Obama, through his Twitter operator, proclaimed the 97% consensus this way. This is an extraordinary claim, for President Obama is essentially saying that 97% of all scientists agree on every element of the global warming hypothesis. Where does this 97% come from? It turns out that consensus research has become a cottage industry within the global warming movement. Prominent among those beating the consensus drum is scientific historian Naomi Oreskes, whose 2004 survey of published scientific papers was cited by Al Gore in his movie An Inconvenient Truth. Since then, climate activists such as Oreskes have conducted more ambitious studies, all predictably showing an overwhelming scientific consensus on global warming, and all serving the propaganda needs of the larger global warming movement. The most influential of these studies was the Cook et al. Study published in 2013, to which the Obama tweet apparently refers. So let's see if the premier global warming consensus study actually supports President Obama's grandiose claim. First off, we notice that President Obama misrepresents the results of the Cook study in two important ways. Cook et al. Said nothing about global warming being dangerous. They also didn't survey scientists directly for their opinions. Rather, they analyzed the abstracts of published articles. So from the outset, we know that the Cook study does not support two parts of his tweet. The Cook researchers set out to determine the level of scientific consensus that human activity is very likely causing most of the current warming. Don't forget that. They examined almost 12,000 abstracts of journal articles which they pulled from a database using global climate change and global warming as the search criteria. Then they grouped the abstracts using the following categories. Our attention is immediately drawn to the first category, explicit endorsement with quantification, which corresponds with their research question. So how many of the abstracts fell in the first category? Based on all the hype surrounding the study and President Obama's tweet, we would expect that 97% of the 12,000 articles fell in the highest category of endorsement. But the first thing we learn from the paper's results is that the 97% is not a percentage of the 12,000 articles. It turned out that 2/3 of the articles, around 8,000 out of the original 12,000, expressed no opinion, and these were then discarded. So the 97% applies to only around 4,000 articles, not the 12,000 they started with. Well, okay, but then do the results show that 97% of the 4,000 abstracts fall in the highest category of endorsement? The authors would have us believe that, as they conclude. Among papers expressing a position on anthropogenic global warming, an overwhelming percentage, 97.2% based on self-ratings, 97.1% based on abstract ratings, endorses the scientific consensus on anthropogenic global warming. But how do they define the scientific consensus on anthropogenic global warming? In the introduction, it is defined as the scientific consensus that human activity is very likely causing most of the current global warming. So the authors clearly represent that 97% of the abstracts expressing an opinion fall in the highest category of endorsement. But note that Cook et al., in reporting their results, do not stick to their original classification scheme. Instead, in order to simplify the analysis, they collapse the original 8 categories into 4: endorse AGW, no position, uncertain, and reject AGW. So the number of abstracts with the highest level of endorsement is lost in the more general endorse AGW grouping and is nowhere disclosed in the paper. That is curious. What could they be hiding? Their original classification scheme was designed to precisely answer their research question. Why change it? Fortunately, the researchers eventually posted their data in their supplementary material, which we were able to download. We then counted all the abstracts with a 1 rating and came up with only 64. Only 64 abstracts out of almost 4,000. That's not even 2%. Here is how honest researchers would have reported their results. Here is how honest researchers would have answered their own research question. We started out asking, what is the level of scientific consensus in the scientific literature that human activity is very likely causing most of the current warming? After analyzing almost 12,000 abstracts, we found that less than 2% explicitly endorse the proposition that human activity is very likely causing most of the current warming. Around 95% either explicitly or implicitly endorse the proposition that human activity is causing warming, but did not quantify the warming. So we have discovered that the level of scientific consensus on global warming, at least as manifest in the scientific literature, is that around 95% endorses the position that human activities are causing some global warming. This, we admit, is a rather trivial finding, as most climate skeptics would agree with that proposition. So President Obama's tweet greatly exaggerates the scientific consensus on whether humans are causing most of the warming. Unfortunately, Cook et al., by misrepresenting their results, have encouraged him to do so. The lead author, John Cook, even repeats this deception in another paper. In Bedford and Cook, John Cook states, Cook et al. Found that over 97% endorsed the view that the Earth is warming up and human emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause. Again, their results show that less than 2% endorse that view, and it is dishonest to report otherwise. What Cook et al. Did, and continue to do, is conflate the 95% of the papers which endorse without quantification with the 2% which endorse with quantification. Then they claim that the 97% endorse with quantification. That is, that 97% endorse the view that the Earth is warming up and human emissions of greenhouse gases are the main or primary cause. And they do this fully conscious that one can make no judgment about what the 95% say about quantification, as they admit on the Skeptical Science website. When addressing the consensus regarding humans being responsible for the majority of recent global warming, the same argument holds true for abstracts that do not quantify the human contribution. We simply can't know their position on the issue. That doesn't mean they endorse or reject the consensus position. They simply don't provide that information. But knowing that didn't stop them from treating the 95% of the abstracts that didn't quantify the human contribution as if they did quantify it. That the authors of a paper would knowingly misrepresent their data is all we need to know in order to properly assess its credibility. But we also observe that the Cook study has been harshly criticized by others. Social psychologist Jose Duarte said, "This study was multiply fraudulent and multiply invalid." Even members of the climate science establishment, such as Professor Mike Hume, founder of the Tyndall Center in the UK, have been critical. Hume says, "The Cook et al. Article is poorly conceived, poorly designed, and poorly executed." Why such harsh criticism? Apart from the defects we've discussed so far, Richard Toll, an IPCC lead author, found that the sampling methods were biased, many articles skeptical about global warming were not included, the approach used to classify the papers was not reliable, many papers were misclassified. To rate the papers, the authors used a small group of environmental activists who did not work independently. We would add that the authors themselves were biased. John Cook and his co-authors are partisans who operate a website called Skeptical Science, which advocates for the climate science establishment. The Cook study was part of a campaign called the Consensus Project, whose aim was to prove there is an overwhelming consensus and influence public opinion. Before the study was even begun, lead author John Cook announced, "It's essential that the public understands that there's a scientific consensus on anthropogenic man-made global warming. So Jim Powell, Dana Nuccitelli, and I have been working on something over the last few months that we hope will have a game-changing impact on the public perception of consensus. Basically, we hope to establish that not only is there a consensus, there is a strengthening consensus." So even before starting the study, they advertised the results they were going to get. Not only that, Cook proposed an entire public relations campaign saying, "We will beat the consensus drum often and regularly and make skeptical science the home of the perceived strengthening consensus." In addition to their methodological flaws and research bias, also disturbing is the researchers' misconduct. Professor Toll reports that requests for the data were met with dishonest evasion and foot-dragging. In this, they were aided and abetted by the journal itself and also the University of Queensland, Cook's employer. We will find that this has become standard operating procedure for activist scientists such as Cook. We conclude that the 97% claim is bogus, and that the Cook et al. Article can be entirely dismissed, not only as a shoddy study, but also as a dishonest piece of propaganda performed by activist researchers serving the global warming establishment. An honest scientific community would have refused to publish such flawed work and propagate its message. The fact that it didn't greatly diminishes the credibility of the entire field of climate consensus research. In our opinion, the consensus on the consensus is unworthy of belief. We will stipulate, however, that while Cook and his colleagues exaggerate the extent of the consensus on global warming, they are correct in alleging that it is the dominant position among establishment scientists. In other words, the conventional wisdom among scientists who comprise what we call the climate science establishment, those in positions of influence and power, the high ground in this conflict, strongly endorses the global warming hypothesis. But the proper attitude towards such consensus is, so what? Recall Michael Crichton's warning about consensus science being the first refuge of scoundrels. Science is not about consensus. It is about observation and hypothesis testing. The more relevant question is not, is there a consensus, so we can follow it like sheep? The important question is whether the consensus position is worthy of belief.